All right, today we'll be talking about the skin. The skin is the larger part of the integumentary system, which includes the skin, the hair, the nails, and the cutaneous glands. Today we'll be focused mostly on the skin itself. The skin is technically the largest organ of your body. About 15% of your body weight is dedicated to skin. So what does it do? Well, it's a barrier. It keeps stuff out, keeps stuff in, and to some degree helps protect against ultraviolet radiation. It's also part of how your body synthesizes vitamin D. It's a sensory organ for touch, temperature, pressure, vibration, that sort of thing. And it's regulatory for temperature. And to some degree, it's how we interact with one another. It's how we recognize one another. It's your outer view on the world. It's how you see people. I suppose without the skin, you'd just be a muscle face, and we'd all look roughly the same as weird muscle faces. So let's take a look at the skin. The skin proper is two layers, the epidermis and the dermis. Now we can see here in this nice little diagram that there are two types of tissue here. There's the epidermis, which is epithelial tissue, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And then there's the dermis underneath that, which is connective tissue. So remember that in epithelial tissue, we just have sheets of cells. And then in connective tissue, the cells are spread out pretty far, and there's a lot of extracellular matrix between the cells. Now, when we look at the epidermis, the outer layer of skin, there are two different types of epidermis, thick skin and thin skin. Thick skin is what covers the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. The extra layer there is due to more dead cells on the outer surface out here, the stratum corneum and the stratum lucidum just below that. The thick skin, the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, have sweat glands, but there are no follicles or oil glands there. All the rest of your body is covered with thin skin, and there the stratum corneum is much thinner, and the stratum lucidum is all but absent. The rest of your body is, of course, covered in oil glands and hair follicles. The epidermis, again, stratified squamous epithelial tissue, is made of 5 different types of cells. We have stem cells. A stem cell is a cell that's replicating. It's an immature cell. It's making copies of itself. It's undergoing mitosis. We find them there in that stratum basale, the basal layer, the lowest layer there of the epidermis. Keratinocytes, most skin cells are keratinocytes. Melanocytes, the little dark cube cells there in the stratum basale, excuse me, those make melanin, which we'll talk about in a bit. Tactile cells, often called Merkel cells, are sensory receptors for touch, pressure, vibration. And then you see those sort of blue dendritic cells, which are part of your immune system. Those are macrophages. They're out there sort of swimming between cells looking for something to kill. Now, those 5 cells are found in 5 different layers of the epidermis. The stratum basale there at the bottom is cuboidal stem cells and some keratinocytes and melanocytes and tactile cells sort of scattered about. Above that, we have the stratum spinosum. This is layers of living keratinocytes. You can see their little purple nucleus. They have a nucleus, they're alive. Above the stratum spinosum, we have the stratum granulosum. Here we find several layers of keratinocytes that have granules called keratohyalin granules in them. Hence the term stratum granulosum. Above that, in at least the thick skin, we have the stratum lucidum. And here we sort of have an intermediate stage. The cells are dead, but they're not quite completely keratinized yet. They're packed with an intermediate protein, ellatin, which will then become keratin to this reaction. The stratum corneum is this outer layer of dead keratinized cells that form the surface of your skin. So as your skin grows, the newer cells are on the bottom layer and the older cells are toward the surface. Remember that epithelial tissue is avascular tissue. There's no blood vessels going through the epidermis. So that means that the further away from that basal layer these cells get, the further away from the source of oxygen and nutrients they are. This is a trigger for apoptosis, or programmed cellular death. And there in the stratum granulosum, they're going to die. You can see here in the stratum spinosum, those little connections between the cells. We talked about those before. Those are desmosomes, like spot welds between the cells. They connect the cells together into sheets of cells. So we get pushed further and further away from the cells that are multiplying below, this constant replication of the stem cells in the stratum basale. In the stratum granulosum, they're going to die. Those keratohyalin granules release this substance that turns the entire cell into keratin. There are membrane coating vesicles that release lipids and helps waterproof these cells. And what we get is layers and layers of these dead, really tough protein-based cells. Now, those dead keratinocytes are constantly falling off. That's called desquamation. If you make that happen physically, it's called exfoliation. So like the $20 soap you buy or your wife buys that has sand in it to exfoliate is stripping away that outer layer of dead cells. Or if you've seen the little fish that will exfoliate your skin for you, and they'll eat away the dead skin, which is super gross. That's the same sort of thing with exfoliation. But desquamation is them falling off. And the little particles of skin are called dander. If they get clumped together into visible particles, usually with oil from hair follicles, it's called dandruff. Here you see this fun little ad from the 50s. They thought dandruff was an infection. Really, she should be less worried about that guy's dandruff and more worried about her personal space. He's not exactly making eye contact there. Awkward moment. Actually, the dandruff issue here was not infection. It was the fact that they were using like 30 weight oil in their hair and, wearing black suits all the time because it was the 50s. That dead skin that's constantly falling off, it's got to go somewhere. And since we're here in West Texas, you'll find dust in your house and seal your windows. That's not what's causing the dust in your house. The dust that's outside is dirt. It's little bits of rock. The dust that's inside, it's little bits of you. The more people you have in your house, the more of this you get. As someone with 5 children running around, I'm dusting a lot because there's just a lot of, gross, dead kid skin everywhere. So that's protein, right? It's keratin, and that makes it a nutrient for organisms, and it supports its own ecosystem. Bacteria and mites, this is the household dust mite, Dermatophagoides. It lives anywhere that you do, and it eats dead skin. Not enough that, you don't have to dust, but still, these are rather ubiquitous little animals. It's an arachnid, so it's got 8 legs, like mites do. Dermatophagoides does not have eyes. It doesn't need them. What do you need eyes for? To find food? Well, pretty much everywhere, dead skin. And to find a mate? Well, they're also pretty much everywhere. Right now, you're thinking about going home and bleaching yourself. That's really not going to help. You find these any place you find excessive dead skin. So things that are upholstered are the worst. If you want to find dust mites in your house, your pillow, because you rub your face on it all the time and the skin comes off your face and it's in your pillow. Bedding, mattresses, you could burn your house down tonight and they're still rather ubiquitous things. You can't completely get rid of them, regardless of how many times you bathe in bleach. They're not actually on you. They're eating your dead skin everywhere else in your house. You're welcome for that. Oh, look, here's Demodex folliculorum. This is the eyelash mite. It's actually, so what we're looking at there with those red arrows, that's sort of the mite's butt sticking up in the air. And that big thing there around is your eyelash. It's feeding on the dead skin and oil that builds up around that follicle. This is a rather large conglomeration of them. Normally, you don't find that many around the base of your eyelashes. It's not microbiology. We did this thing and talked about the eyelash mite, and somebody's got them, and or at least this is what I told my class. So I had 30 undergrads pulling out their eyelashes to put under microscope so we could see if anybody had eyelash mites. I don't know. I don't even remember if anybody actually had any mites, but it was fun to watch them all pull out their eyelashes for an hour. These aren't parasitic. They're not hurting you, and your immune system really doesn't care about them until they get numerous, and then you might see some inflammation around the base of the eyelash. Other than that, they're just there. If you want to keep their numbers down or eliminate them, wash your friggin' face. Here's scabies, Sarcoptes scabii. This is actually burrowing under the epidermis. You can see its little trail there. Itches like crazy because your immune system does respond to that crap. Scabies is super contagious. If they ever have a scabies outbreak in a school, they'll shut that place down because it is incredibly contagious. Your skin is home to an infinite number of microorganisms, not just things like mites, but yeast and bacteria. And regardless of the amount of bathing you do, you're never going to completely remove them. You're sort of like a bacterial god. You're their entire universe. And occasionally you try to kill them all, but they just, keep living there. What happens is that the balance between these microorganisms gets thrown off, where either the bacteria or the yeast proliferate more than the other, and then we see this sort of skin infection. Normally, they kind of keep each other in check. Anytime there's moisture that's kept next to the skin, that's going to weaken the skin. And those microorganisms are opportunistic and they will infect you. So we see this in one good example. This is diaper rash, where the moisture and the bacteria are kept next to the skin and it's weakened, and diaper rash can get really bad. We see it in dressings, like for wounds that are kept on way too long and the skin becomes infected like this. Various yeast infections and bacterial infections of the skin. There's just a ton of them. And symptoms can range from mild inflammation and irritation to necrosis, just depending on the organism. So it's important that you keep the skin clean, realizing that you're never, ever going to be sterile. I imagine that in microbiology, they made you touch one of those TSA plates just to see your fingerprints in bacteria the next day. There are always going to be some degree of microorganisms on you. Now, that's the epidermis, the outer layer. The dermis is deep to that. Now, this is connective tissue proper. So the cells are spread out pretty far, and there's a lot of fibrous extracellular material, collagen fibers, some elastic fibers and reticular fibers, fibroblasts, all these cells that we would normally associate with connective tissue proper. The hair follicles and the nail roots are there. There's lots of blood vessels here. Whereas in the epidermis, we were avascular. There's lots of blood vessels here, and there's oil glands and nerve endings. There's little muscles for all your hair follicles called piloerector muscles to make your hair stand on end. What's the point of that? Why is that even a thing? Well, this is a good example of how we can look at other animals and realize our relationship to them. When you see an animal like a cat or a porcupine, they make their hair stand on end, and it's more significant. It makes the cat look bigger. The porcupine stands those quills on end so that you get impaled. There's more function there for other animals than what we have. Your hair stands on end and it warns you of impending ghosts. It really doesn't have a function for us. It's a vestigial organ. It does have functions in other animals, however. In the face, muscle connects directly to the collagen fibers in the dermis. Everywhere else, muscle is going to be connected to bone. But here it connects to the collagen fibers, and it's what produces facial expressions. So we see this wavy boundary between the epidermis and the dermis, and it holds them together, kind of dovetails those things together. The upward projections there of the dermis are called dermal papillae, and the downward projections of the epidermis are called epidermal ridges. The papillary layer is the outer layer of the dermis, and it's where we see those dermal papillae. Lots of blood vessels there too. It's kind of a lighter purple color in this picture. The reticular layer is the deeper layer and more dense, irregular connective tissue. Now you can tear those collagen fibers in the reticular layer and produce stretch marks. Under the skin is a layer of tissue called the hypodermis. The hypodermis is not part of the skin. Hypodermis means under the skin, subcutaneous tissue. Its job is to hold the skin to the underlying tissue. Now, lots of blood vessels through here in the hypodermis. Subcutaneous fat is a type of hypodermis. When you hear the term hypodermic needle, that's the short needle that's long enough to go into this layer to inject something into, which it's going to be taken up by the bloodstream very quickly. So hypodermis, under the skin, not part of the skin. One of the things that we always notice about the skin is that it differs from person to person. And one of those ways that it differs is in pigment. The pigment of your skin is produced by melanocytes. There are two forms of melanin, the pigment, eumelanin, which is kind of a brownish black color, and pheomelanin, which is kind of a red-yellow color. The thing is that all people basically have the same number of melanocytes. What varies is in how much melanin they produce. And of course, that is varied based on your genetics. This is heredity. You inherit this skin tone from the generations before you. The amount of melanin that's in your skin also will vary with your exposure to ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light stimulates those melanocytes to make melanin, which darkens the skin. Here you see this guy's 20/20 tan line, where the mask was. Melanin is a photoprotectant. The more melanin that's produced there means that you have more protection from that ultraviolet radiation. The ultraviolet radiation damages the DNA of cells, and your body responds by producing melanin so that the next time you're covered. That doesn't mean that it stops any damage that's just been done. It's just responding to that damage. We see other things with skin tone. Hemoglobin is the red pigment in skin, and it adds sort of a pink red color to the skin. Carotene is a yellow-orange pigment that you can get in your diet. It will concentrate in the stratum corneum. If you go on the all-carrot diet, you'll turn yourself orange. I'm not talking like Oompa Loompa orange, more Donald Trump, President Trump orange, somewhere in between those two things. You can really overdo this and make yourself pretty orange. Google that. There's some great images of people that have accidentally or intentionally done this. We can diagnose things based on skin color, or at least have an idea of what's going on. This is cyanosis. This is caused by congenital heart defect in this case. But cyanosis usually refers to any blueness of the skin that's caused by a lack of oxygen. And in this case, we have a cyanotic heart defect, which is a topic that we'll talk about next semester. This is erythema. Erythema is a term that refers to any abnormal redness of the skin. Blushing is a form of erythema. It's always really kind of splotchy. It can be injury or infection or allergic reaction. Anytime the skin is abnormally red, whether you have like a insect bite or a rash, that's this abnormal redness of the skin. Pallor, which you see in the patient's hand with the red arrow on it, it's sort of a grayness of the skin. It's caused by either a lack of oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, like with anemia, or a lack of blood flow to the skin. Pallor is the color that you would see in someone who is deceased. That sort of gray color because there's no longer any blood circulating to the skin. Albinism is the complete lack of melanin based on genetics. And you can still see like the red patches in the face because there's still blood vessels and you can still see the hemoglobin, but there's no melanin. This leaves them susceptible to damage from ultraviolet light. One of my dad's friends has albinism, and I've met him maybe twice in my life. And the last time I met him, we were at Texas Motor Speedway, middle of the summer. It's 1,000 degrees outside, and the man's wearing basically a parka and wraparound shades just to limit his exposure to the sun. Even though it was ridiculously hot, he has to limit exposure to the sun because he has no natural defense to that ultraviolet radiation. Often, these people, their eyes will seem sort of a pink shade, and that's because there's no pigment in the iris of the eye either, so you can see the redness of the retina through the iris, and that leaves their eyes susceptible to damage as well. Jaundice is a yellowing of the skin that's caused by a buildup of bilirubin in the body. And this is not uncommon in infants, just because their liver hasn't quite kicked in yet. In an adult, jaundice indicates something going wrong with the liver, and it is a serious medical issue, and you should seek immediate attention. Liver failure is not something that you want to delay any sort of treatment on. This is severe jaundice, so much so that the whites of her eyes have yellowed. Hematoma is a bruise. It's a blood clot. It shows through the skin. Here we see this hematoma in this guy's leg. I don't recall where I got this picture, but I nearly want to say it was from some stupid prank website, and they hit him with a baseball bat for laughs. Anyway, you can see the blood clot. It's ruptured those subcutaneous blood vessels, and that blood's leaked out. In severe or large blood clots, this might have to be debrided, where they go in and open that up and remove the clot from under the skin. But in smaller bruises, and you're aware of this, it resolves itself. You can see that breakdown of hemoglobin as it happens. The bruise goes from being sort of a purple red color to kind of yellow green as that hemoglobin breaks down. This is argyria. Argyria is a blueness of the skin that's caused by the ingestion of colloidal silver. What's colloidal silver? How do you get that? I want to be a Smurf. I hear these things all the time. So here's the thing. Silver is slightly antimicrobial. I'm not telling you that silver is penicillin. I'm telling you that bacteria don't appreciate it. So at some point, someone decided that maybe it was wise to ingest silver as a colloid, so it's suspended in water. So you have the silver, it's suspended in water, you drink it. For the most part, that's harmless. Now, if you overdo that, that silver will begin to concentrate in the body, and one of the places it concentrates in is the skin. If you've ever owned anything made out of silver, you know that silver tarnishes. If you understand how pictures work, how photographs work. For those of you who don't know this, we used to have these things called cameras, and it used this stuff called film. And you push the button on the camera, it exposed the film to the light. The light put the image on the film, then you develop the film. Well, it's a chemical reaction that happens when that silver chemicals in the film were exposed to light. If you know anything about photography, there are actually photos called silver types where you expose silver to light and it tarnishes where the photograph would be. Anyway, so same principle, but now that silver's in your skin and it changes color and it makes you pop a Smurf. I don't know the status of either of these people. Papa Smurf there was on Oprah at some point. She was kind of freaked out that he was blue, as was Dr. Oz. Which, I mean, for Dr. Oz to be freaked out about anything significant, this is non-reversible. It's just going to get worse. And I don't know what kind of career you have to look forward to there. I'm telling you, don't do this. Sebaceous glands are oil glands. They secrete sebum, which is the oil, and they're associated with the hair follicles. Sweat glands are also called pseudodiphorous glands, and there's two forms of sweat glands, apocrine and eccrine. Apocrine glands aren't true apocrine glands. They're apocrine sweat glands. They are merocrine glands, and we talked about those different gland types when we talked about this. And epithelial tissue, we just never changed the name. They're not breaking off pieces of themselves. They're secreting the sticker sweat. It's not used in cooling the body. It's what you would associate with the underarm and inguinal regions. It's also what you would associate with body odor. Eccrine sweat glands are distributed all over the body. They're small. They're the ones that are used in cooling the body with sweat. Now, one thing that is important here is that we talked about functions of the skin. We're talking about these sweat glands. Sweat glands are used in cooling the body. The skin is not an organ of detoxification. The organs that do that are your livers and your kidneys. Your liver, you have one, but there's multiple people. So collectively, all your whatever. So your liver, your kidneys, these are detoxification organs. Toxins may be found in sweat, especially if they're in higher concentration within the body, but that does not make this a major mode of detoxification. If you're severely drunk, you may be able to smell that alcohol through the skin, but that does not mean it's being detoxified in such a way. So these foot pads that you can buy, and if we were in class, I would show you, I've got a box of them in my office, or the foot baths that you soak your feet in. It's supposed to remove toxins. That's not how that works. Anything that is supposed to remove toxins from your blood through your skin is not doing that, because that's not how that works. Your liver and your kidneys are tasked with detoxification and the removal of toxins from the body. Mammary glands, cereminous glands are the earwax things. They're actually modified sweat glands, and we're not going to spend any time there. We're also not going to spend any time talking about the hair and the nails. Dermatology is the field of medicine that deals with the skin, and it's actually one of the more competitive fields in medicine. So if you end up going to medical school, dermatology programs are very, very competitive. That's because at some point in our lives, pretty much everyone has a medical complaint about the skin. Above the age of 60, nearly all people have some sort of issue with the skin that requires medical intervention. Now, this ranges from acne, dermatitis, which is any inflammation of the skin, eczema, psoriasis. We see all these different things. One thing on this little chart that I'll note is tinea. This is any fungal infection of the skin, which includes athlete's foot and ringworm. Ringworm is not a worm, and this is why I mentioned this. It grows in this little circle, and it kind of looks like it, but it is not a worm. It is treated with an antifungal agent. I mention this because one of the first semesters I taught, I casually mentioned this, and a student after class showed me the nice little scar on his arm where he had attempted to cut the worm out at some point in his life, only to realize there was not a worm in there. You can treat this with like tinactin, so don't start carving up your skin. You're welcome. Here's acne, when the duct of those oil glands gets clogged with dead skin and oil, and bacteria move in and colonize it. And then your immune system responds with inflammation. This is associated with puberty because of the rapid growth of these tissues. Hormonal imbalances, this sort of thing that cause this. Here's psoriasis. Psoriasis is an autoimmune issue, and the immune system causes inflammation. New skin cells are produced too quickly. In psoriasis, we see these big red splotchy areas. They're itchy, and the skin, instead of falling off into microscopic particles, will come off in sheets, these big silvery scales. Psoriasis is often associated with a form of arthritis as well, which is another type of autoimmune thing we'll talk about when we get to joints, psoriatic arthritis. Again, so this is just an autoimmune issue here. Skin cancer is often one of the things we concern ourselves with, and there are different forms of skin cancer. Here's the basal cell carcinoma. This is the most common form of skin cancer and the least dangerous. It doesn't often metastasize, although it can. The basal cell carcinoma usually presents as a smooth raised bump on the head, neck, or shoulders, places that are exposed to the sun. They estimate around 800,000 cases every year in the United States. Around 30% of Caucasians will have a basal cell carcinoma at some point. How that's treated just depends on where it is. Usually it's removing that, and you should be fine. This is a squamous cell carcinoma from the stratum spinosum. Here, again, your chances of recovery are really pretty good. Squamous cell carcinomas usually present as an ulceration with hard raised edges. Metastasis here is not uncommon, but it is pretty slowly growing. The squamous cell carcinoma is a little different because not only does your exposure to ultraviolet light cause this, but also tobacco use and HPV. Finally, we have the malignant melanoma. This is the most serious form of skin cancer from the melanocytes, and it will metastasize very quickly. Most skin cancer deaths are attributed to melanoma. 75% of skin cancer deaths, actually. So you're looking at all the little spots on your arm right now and wondering if that's cancer. So rules here. Is it asymmetrical? Does it have an irregular border? Is it multiple colors? Bigger than 6 millimeters? And is it bigger than it was yesterday? Any of those things are true, you might want to have that looked at. Treatment for this is removing that tumor and the tissue around it and beneath it. They take a chunk out of you. And often you're going to have to undergo chemotherapy just to be sure. So these are quickly metastatic tumors, and it is straight up caused by your exposure to ultraviolet light. So another public service announcement for you. Tanning beds are known human carcinogens, as are cigarettes, asbestos, mustard gas, and radiation. Women of all ages who visit a tanning bed once a month increase their risk of malignant melanoma by 55%. Women who use tanning beds before the age of 30 increase their risk of malignant melanoma by 75%. This is why many states have begun to regulate the use of ultraviolet tanning beds significantly, also tax them. Not only do you increase your risk of skin cancer, this excessive tanning also ages the skin prematurely, and you get photo aging of the skin. So it's going to cause this sort of leathery look, wrinkling, and age spots as you get older. Several years ago, we had this case, the tanning mom. So this little girl and her mom were on the news because her mom there let the small redheaded child tan with her. The mom has a psychological issue where she like visits 4 tanning beds every day and has like 40 different tanning memberships, and looks like a catcher's mitt. So yeah, that's all tan, incidentally. They're mother and daughter. And she let the little girl tan, which is illegal in the state she was in. You have to be 18 years old to tan, and also unsafe for a small child. This is the sort of the classic picture of photo aging, where you see this lady who at the time I believe was in her mid-60s, and the wrinkling there, and then you have this this monk who is older but less photo aging of the skin. Wear sunscreen. One of the leading causes of accidental death is burning, and with burns, death will occur to infection or fluid loss, or just the straight up destruction of tissue if there's any involvement of the respiratory system and the effects of the dead tissue. That dead tissue has to be removed fairly quickly so that it's not toxic to the living tissue around it. We classify burns in different degrees. There's a first-degree burn. A first-degree burn is a partial thickness burn. It only involves the epidermis. It sucks. It hurts. Sunburn is first-degree burn. It's going to be better. You'll be fine. Second-degree burn will involve the epidermis and some of the dermis, still a partial thickness burn. You see some blistering, that white tan color. That's second degree. It hurts. It's still going to heal. You might require a skin graft if it affects a significant area of the body. But second-degree burns have a good prognosis. There can be some scarring here. Third-degree burn is a full-thickness burn. The epidermis, the dermis are destroyed, and the underlying tissue, the subcutaneous tissue, is often involved. This will require excision of the wound, so that dead tissue has to be removed, and often grafting skin grafts that go there. Often the textbooks will tell you first-degree burns, second-degree burns, painful. Third-degree burns, not so much. I've had 2 students that have been burned severely with third-degree burns, and both of them said that that's an utter lie, that it's the worst pain they've ever been in. One guy said it, and he'd had several skin grafts, and it still hurt. But often the nerve endings to that area are destroyed, and so while they might not be able to detect sensation there, there's still quite a bit of pain. A 4th-degree burn is not going to heal at all. Here, the skin, the muscle, and the bone underneath will be damaged by the fire, and here there's no excision of the wound. This will require amputation of the limb. Often these burns are fatal. To determine survivability of burns, there are several factors that are calculated. Sort of the classical way to do this is to add your age and the total body surface area that's injured by burning. The higher that number is, the less likely you are to survive. This is a box score, a bow score. I actually have never heard it pronounced. And this is the sum of the patient's age and the total surface area burned. And now we add an additional 17 points if there's any respiratory involvement, as that increases the likelihood of fatality. The higher the score, the less survivable it is. And different burn units have different capabilities. The best burn units will have survivability up to about 140, and after 140, there's typically not very much survivability. Um, so there are better and worse burn units, but that gives you an idea of that survivability. So from here, we'll move on and talk about the skeletal system and joints. So look for those lectures shortly after this one.